Just outside this small Montana town stands a brick smokestack, 585 feet tall, built from more than 2.5 million individual bricks, and once recognized as the tallest freestanding masonry structure anywhere on the entire planet, constructed specifically to carry poisonous smoke high enough into the atmosphere that it would supposedly stop landing on the people living directly beneath it. It did not work, not for nearly a century. By the time the smelter that Stack served finally closed for good, it had contaminated more than 300 square miles of soil, groundwater, and surface water across an entire river valley with arsenic, lead, and cadmium, made this stretch of southwestern Montana one of the largest and most expensive Superfund cleanup sites anywhere in the entire United States, and left behind, among its stranger legacies, a golf course built directly on top of capped toxic waste as one of the only significant pieces of new infrastructure the town would see for the following 2 decades. This is the story of Anaconda, Montana, a company town built entirely to serve one of the largest, richest copper mining operations the world has ever seen, and a place that demonstrates, in the most literal and most physically toxic terms imaginable, exactly what happens when a corporation's fortune and an entire town's air, water, and soil are allowed to become permanently, inseparably, the same thing for the better part of a century. Anaconda exists today because of a deliberate, calculated decision made by one of the most consequential and most ruthlessly effective industrialists in the entire history of the American West. Marcus Daly, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in the United States as a teenager with essentially nothing to his name, and worked his way up through the Western mining industry from common laborer to mine superintendent through sheer persistence and an increasingly well-regarded eye for promising ore bodies, purchased a modest silver claim called the Anaconda Mine near Butte, Montana, in 1880, partnering with a group of California financiers that included George Hearst, father of the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, along with James Ben Ali Hagan and Lloyd Tevis, to properly develop the claim at genuine commercial scale. What Daly's crews found once serious excavation began proved considerably more valuable than the silver the operation had originally been purchased to extract in the first place. By 1883, Daly's miners had driven a vertical shaft 650 feet straight into the earth and struck a vein of copper sulfide ore that widened, at its richest point, to a full 100 feet across, representing, by the professional assessment of experienced mining engineers examining the find at the time, quite possibly the single richest body of copper ore yet discovered anywhere on the entire planet. A deposit substantial enough that Daly moved almost immediately to organize the Anaconda Copper Mining Company specifically to develop and exploit it at genuine industrial scale rather than as a modest regional mining operation. Rather than continue what had become an increasingly expensive and logistically cumbersome process of shipping raw butte ore all the way across the ocean to Wales for proper refining, the standard industry practice of the era for handling especially complex, difficult-to-process copper ores, Daly made the considerably bolder and more capital-intensive decision to build an entirely new, dedicated smelting operation of his own design and choosing. He personally selected a site 26 miles west of Butte along the banks of Warm Springs Creek, a location chosen specifically for its genuinely ample water supply, its convenient proximity to substantial nearby limestone deposits, essential to the copper smelting process itself, and prevailing local wind patterns that Daly's own engineers confidently believed would efficiently disperse the smelter's inevitable smoke safely away from any nearby populated area, an engineering assumption that would prove over the following century to be catastrophically and expensively mistaken. According to a story still fondly told by longtime local residents today, Daly personally surveyed the empty, undeveloped valley floor before construction began, spotted a single cow grazing placidly in an open field near the creek, pointed directly at the animal without hesitation, and declared, with the kind of casual absolute authority only a man of his considerable wealth and confidence could command, that he wanted his brand new town's central main street to run precisely north and south directly through the exact spot where that particular cow happened to be standing at that moment. Daly officially filed the plat for his new town on October 27, 1883, initially attempting to name the fledgling settlement Copperopolis in reference to its obvious intended purpose, before discovering, to his mild irritation, that name was already legally claimed by another, considerably smaller mining camp elsewhere in Montana, and settling instead on the name Anaconda, drawn directly from the mine, whose discovery had made the entire ambitious venture possible in the first place. Growth arrived almost immediately thereafter, and at a pace that genuinely startled even experienced, well-traveled observers of typical Western mining boomtowns. Within a single calendar year of the town's official founding, Anaconda already supported 4 separate hotels, 24 individual stores selling everything from patent medicines and basic groceries to fine clothing and household furnishings, 3 separate lumber yards, 2 working blacksmiths, 2 competing liveries, 2 commercial photography studios, a fully functioning bank, 5 separate barbershops, an honest-to-goodness ice skating rink, and a genuinely startling total of 20 separate saloons, doing brisk business alongside 2 churches already offering regular Sunday services to a population that, barely 12 months earlier, had not existed in any organized civic form whatsoever. Daly's own personal showpiece building, the genuinely elegant Montana Hotel, anchored the town's rapidly developing commercial district from the very start, and workers along with their families arrived by the thousands from across the entire world, from Ireland and Cornwall, from Wales and Eastern Europe and well beyond, drawn overwhelmingly by smelter wages that, whatever the increasingly brutal and increasingly toxic working conditions those wages actually reflected, still offered considerably more day-to-day economic security than most of the realistic alternatives available to industrial laborers anywhere else in the entire country during this period. Anaconda's fortunes became inseparably entangled with one of the most colorful, most bitterly personal, and ultimately most consequential political rivalries in the entire history of the American West, almost from the very moment the smelter first began full operations. Marcus Daly and a rival, considerably more socially ambitious Butte mining magnate named William Andrews Clark, had already been locked, for years by this point, in an escalating personal and commercial rivalry that gradually split the entire young state of Montana along deep, overlapping lines of ethnicity, religion, and raw competitive commercial ambition alike. Daly represented the hard-working, self-made Irish Catholic immigrant who had built his considerable fortune essentially from nothing through pure grit and an unusually sharp eye for mineral deposits, while Clark, by sharp contrast, embodied the considerably more socially ambitious English Protestant financier who openly craved elected political office and genuine national respectability, in equal, competing measure, financing his own newspaper, the Butte Miner, specifically to advance his political ambitions across the state. That deep-seated rivalry reached its single most consequential public flashpoint in 1894, when the young state of Montana, having only achieved formal statehood 5 years earlier in 1889, held a decisive runoff referendum specifically to determine its permanent official state capital, a contest that had gradually narrowed down after an initial multi-city vote in 1892 failed to produce any outright majority winner, to just 2 remaining finalist cities, the existing temporary capital of Helena and Daly's own carefully constructed company town of Anaconda itself. Daly poured a genuine fortune into aggressively promoting his own hometown's capital bid, reasoning, with fairly transparent self-interest that few Montanans of the era failed to notice or comment on, that a permanent state capital physically located inside Anaconda would place the entire day-to-day machinery of Montana's state government conveniently and permanently within his own company's direct sphere of commercial and political influence. Clark, recognizing with equal clarity exactly what his hated rival stood to gain from such an arrangement, threw his own considerable financial resources behind Helena's competing campaign specifically and primarily to deny Daly that particular strategic advantage, regardless of Helena's own genuine merits or deficiencies as a candidate capital. The resulting statewide campaign devolved into one of the ugliest, most openly and shamelessly corrupt political contests in the entire recorded history of the state, with partisans on both sides publishing scathing, deliberately inflammatory, satirical pamphlets, lambasting the rival city's supposed moral and social deficiencies in considerable, gleeful detail. One particularly notorious pamphlet, published by the editor of the pro-Anaconda Standard newspaper, entitled with elaborate sarcasm, Helena's Social Supremacy, mercilessly mocked the temporary capital's own chaotic, frequently dysfunctional territorial era legislative history, while Helena's own considerably numerous supporters countered by branding Anaconda little more than a crude, thoroughly company-controlled industrial labor camp, entirely unsuited to the dignity and independence a genuine state capital properly required. The 2 rival copper barons collectively spent an estimated $3 million, a genuinely staggering sum of money for the era, in a determined effort to sway individual voters across the entire sparsely populated state, and when the final ballots were at last fully counted, Helena narrowly prevailed by a margin of roughly 27,000 votes to Anaconda's 25,000, a hard-fought political defeat for Daly's own hometown that nonetheless did remarkably little to slow the continued physical and industrial expansion of the smelter complex itself in all the years that immediately followed. Daly personally continued overseeing and expanding his smelting operation right up until his own death in November 1900, and construction on what would eventually become the vastly enlarged Washoe Reduction Works, the original plant's considerably more ambitious successor facility, was substantially complete by 1902, just 2 years after its principal founder's passing. The completed industrial complex grew steadily over the following 2 decades into what its own corporate operators proudly, and by most contemporary accounts, entirely accurately, advertised as the single largest nonferrous metal processing plant located anywhere on the entire planet, By 1919, its towering centerpiece smokestack, standing a full 585 feet tall and constructed entirely from more than 2.5 million individually laid bricks, had become widely recognized as the tallest masonry structure of any kind existing anywhere in the entire world, a genuinely remarkable feat of early 20th century industrial engineering ambition, built for the specific, and ultimately quite futile, purpose of carrying the smelter's considerable toxic exhaust high enough up into the surrounding atmosphere that it would theoretically disperse harmlessly across a wide enough area before ever settling back down to ground level again. At its absolute peak, wartime production during the Second World War, when American war industries suddenly demanded copper wiring, shell casings, and electrical components in staggering quantities the country had genuinely never required at any previous point in its history, the Washoe smelter processed an extraordinary 15,000 tons of raw copper ore every single day without interruption, a scale of continuous industrial operation that made Anaconda, quite literally, one of the single most strategically important industrial facilities feeding the entire American war effort, and that reflected, in the starkest possible terms, just how completely Daly's original 1883 gamble on one especially promising copper vein had grown within a single working lifetime into a genuinely globe-spanning industrial and financial empire. Picture Anaconda on a weekday evening sometime in the 1940s, near the absolute peak of the smelter's wartime production output and civic importance alike. The towering 585-foot brick stack looms visibly over literally every single street in town from virtually any vantage point, a permanent, entirely inescapable landmark whose massive base sits at the physical center of an industrial complex sprawling steadily up the hillside directly above the residential community it employs, in one capacity or another almost entirely. Shift workers stream steadily toward and away from the smelter's own gates around the clock in overlapping waves, since a facility processing 15,000 tons of raw ore every single day, exactly like Braddock's own Edgar Thomson Works 2,000 miles away to the east, has essentially no meaningful operational concept of genuine, extended downtime of any kind. A faint, persistent metallic tang hangs perpetually in the evening air on those particular days when the prevailing wind fails to carry the smelter's characteristic smoke away quite as efficiently as Daly's original engineers had so confidently promised it always would. An odor most longtime residents by this point have long since stopped consciously noticing at all, in precisely the way people anywhere eventually stop registering a persistent, ever-present background feature of the only hometown they have ever personally known. Daly's own elegant Montana hotel still anchors a genuinely bustling downtown commercial district, doing brisk, steady business feeding, clothing, and entertaining a working population whose wages, whatever the increasingly well-documented occupational health risks the job itself actually carried, remain considerably better on average than most realistic alternatives available anywhere else across rural Montana at the time. Out along Warm Springs Creek, the very water Daly had originally selected this specific site for, on account of its genuine abundance, now runs measurably, chemically different than it ever did before the smelter's arrival, carrying steadily accumulating trace concentrations of copper and zinc that, while not yet fully understood by most ordinary residents to pose any serious direct danger to themselves personally, are already demonstrably proving lethal, generation after generation, to the native Rocky Mountain trout that had once filled the exact same mountain stream in genuine abundance. Nobody standing casually on Main Street that particular evening, precisely at the spot where Marcus Daly himself once famously pointed at a grazing cow to mark his intended thoroughfare, has much practical reason at all to imagine that the very same smokestack towering directly over their evening commute home will, within only another 4 decades' time, stand instead as the primary, defining landmark of one of the largest and most expensive environmental cleanup sites anywhere in the entire country. Daly himself did not live long enough to witness either the smelter's eventual full industrial maturity or its considerably later environmental reckoning. He sold the entire Anaconda Copper Mining Company outright to a powerful financial syndicate led by Standard Oil interests in 1899 for the sum of $39 million, and the company itself, subsequently renamed, in succession the Amalgamated Copper Company, and then, still later, simply the Anaconda Copper Company, grew steadily over the following several decades into one of the single largest and most far-reaching mining conglomerates anywhere on the entire planet, eventually ranking, by the late 1920s, among the 4 largest corporations of any kind in the entire world, with active mining and smelting operations stretching from Chile and Mexico all the way to Poland and across virtually the entire American West simultaneously. Anaconda's own enduring status as a genuine, thoroughly dependent company town, if anything, intensified rather than meaningfully diminished under this new, considerably more distant and more impersonal corporate ownership structure, the community's entire economic and civic life bound up almost completely in strategic decisions made first by Standard Oil's own Eastern financiers, and later by an ever-rotating cast of professional corporate executives who, quite unlike Daly himself, had frequently never once personally set foot in the actual Montana Valley, their company's smelter, nonetheless, continued to completely dominate, economically and physically alike. The environmental cost of 8 full decades of essentially continuous industrial smelting proved, in the end, every bit as substantial and as far-reaching as the smelter's own genuinely impressive industrial output. And that cost accumulated gradually, year after year, in ways that were, for the overwhelming majority of the plant's long operating history, simply treated by nearly everyone involved as an unavoidable, largely unremarkable feature of ordinary daily life in a smelter town, rather than as the genuine escalating public health emergency it was quietly and steadily becoming. Smelting raw copper ore at true industrial scale inevitably releases substantial quantities of arsenic, lead, and cadmium as essentially unavoidable chemical byproducts of the refining process itself. And for decades on end, the plant's enormous smokestack simply carried those toxic byproducts directly out into the surrounding atmosphere, where prevailing regional winds then distributed them steadily across an area that would eventually be precisely measured once federal regulators finally undertook a truly comprehensive environmental survey decades later at more than 300 square miles of measurably contaminated soil, groundwater, and surface water, stretching well beyond even Anaconda's own official town limits and deep into surrounding ranchland and several neighboring rural communities. Farmers and ranchers, working land situated downwind of the smelter, had been actively complaining about the visible, tangible damage to their own crops and livestock for decades by this point, describing scorched, blackened vegetation, chronically sickened cattle herds, and agricultural soil that, by the consistent accounts of multiple successive generations within the very same ranching families, simply never seemed to fully recover its former natural productivity, regardless of how carefully or patiently it was subsequently managed. These accumulated grievances occasionally found their way into Montana's own state courts over the decades, but rarely resulted in any judgment substantial enough to meaningfully alter or restrict the smelter's continued day-to-day operations in any serious way. A broader pattern of quiet legal accommodation between powerful industrial polluters and comparatively under-resourced local courts that echoed similar, closely comparable, legal battles playing out around heavy industrial sites scattered across the entire country throughout the early and middle 20th century alike. The genuine reckoning that eventually did arrive came not from any single lawsuit or court judgment, but rather from the exact same broader economic forces that were simultaneously reshaping heavy industry across the entire country by the late 1970s. Declining domestic copper ore grades, steadily rising energy costs, increasingly stringent federal environmental regulations passed in the wake of the Environmental Protection Agency's own creation in 1970, and mounting foreign competition from considerably newer, more modern, more efficient smelting operations located overseas, all combined together to make the aging Anaconda facility, by this point, already more than 9 full decades old in its basic underlying design and physical location, an increasingly uneconomical and increasingly difficult to justify proposition for whichever particular corporate parent happened to control it at any given moment. Atlantic Richfield Company, the considerably larger oil conglomerate commonly known simply as ARCO, purchased the Anaconda Company's remaining Montana mining and smelting operations outright in 1977, and within just 3 additional years of careful internal review, concluded that continued smelting operations at the increasingly aging Anaconda site could simply no longer be reasonably justified on purely economic grounds alone. The smelter closed for good in 1980, permanently ending nearly a full century of essentially continuous copper processing on this exact stretch of Montana ground, and the shutdown's immediate, devastating impact on the surrounding community proved every bit as transformative, in the opposite direction as the plant's original 1883 arrival had once been. By careful contemporary estimates, roughly 78% of every job existing in Anaconda at the time had been directly tied, in one fashion or another, to the smelter's continued operation. And the closure emptied out the local economy with a speed and a thoroughness that longtime residents themselves still recall with genuine, undisguised bitterness even decades later. One particular longtime resident later recalled, with a certain grim humor, that the very first commercial business to formally evacuate town following the closure announcement was, of all things, a local Kentucky fried chicken franchise. A small but telling detail residents have cited ever since, as clear evidence of just how quickly outside commercial confidence in the town's future evaporated entirely, giving rise to a bleak local saying that asked, only half in genuine jest, whether the very last person to finally leave Anaconda would remember to turn off the lights on their way out the door. What the smelter left behind, once its towering stack finally stopped producing smoke for good, proved to be one of the single largest and most chemically complex environmental contamination sites the federal government had ever formally encountered anywhere in the country. In September 1983, the Environmental Protection Agency formally designated the entire Anaconda smelter site, encompassing the town of Anaconda itself, along with the neighboring community of Opportunity and a full 40-mile stretch of surrounding creeks and natural drainages, as one of the very first sites ever placed on the brand new federal Superfund program's National Priorities List, a designation directly reflecting the genuinely extreme concentrations of arsenic, lead, copper, cadmium, and zinc that 80 consecutive years of continuous industrial smelting had steadily deposited across the region's soil, groundwater, and surface water alike. The sheer scale of contamination ultimately uncovered during subsequent painstaking federal investigation proved genuinely staggering, even by typical Superfund program standards. Massive black slag heaps, the glassy, dense waste byproduct of the copper smelting process itself, covered hundreds of acres in towering mounds visible clearly for miles in every direction. Arsenic-laden flue dust had steadily settled directly into residential yards and family gardens throughout Anaconda's own established residential neighborhoods over the decades, and serious groundwater contamination extended for miles beyond the smelter's own original industrial property boundaries. Atlantic Richfield, as the final corporate entity to have owned and directly operated the facility at the moment of its closure, bore primary legal and financial responsibility under federal Superfund law for funding essentially the entire resulting cleanup effort. A genuinely massive undertaking that would eventually stretch across more than 4 full decades and ultimately cost the company an estimated $450 million in direct remediation expenses alone, making the Anaconda site, by almost any reasonable measure available, one of the single largest and most expensive individual Superfund cleanups ever undertaken anywhere in the entire United States. The cleanup effort itself produced, alongside its more conventional expected remediation work, one of the more genuinely unusual and widely discussed redevelopment projects in the entire history of the federal Superfund program. In 1994, Atlantic Richfield formally partnered with Deer Lodge County and the celebrated golf course design firm of golf legend Jack Nicklaus to transform 250 acres of the former smelter grounds into what became known as the Old Works Golf Course, reportedly the very first full golf course ever constructed directly on top of an actively monitored Superfund cleanup site anywhere in the entire country. Nicklaus's own design team worked in close, sustained collaboration with Arco's environmental engineers to carefully route the course's fairways and greens directly around, and in several notable places directly on top of, areas containing the very highest remaining concentrations of residual arsenic, capping the most seriously contaminated hotspots beneath a specially engineered clay barrier layer specifically designed and tested to prevent the underlying toxic material from ever leaching further into the surrounding groundwater supply, while simultaneously incorporating surviving historic mining artifacts, including carefully preserved sections of the original smelter's foundations and striking black slag formations, directly into the finished course's own landscaping and overall visual design as a deliberate aesthetic feature to be admired, rather than something requiring complete concealment or demolition. The course opened to considerable local fanfare and no small amount of genuine civic pride as a tangible symbol of the town's emerging pivot away from a mining-based economy and toward tourism and outdoor recreation instead, even as the far broader Superfund cleanup efforts surrounding it continued grinding steadily forward, one contaminated property and one creek drainage at a time, for decades still left to come after the course's own opening. That broader, ongoing cleanup effort became the subject of a genuinely significant United States Supreme Court case decided in 2220, one that meaningfully reshaped how federal Superfund law itself operates at complex, multi-decade contaminated sites scattered across the entire country. Back in 2008, a group of 98 individual Montana landowners whose own private properties happened to sit within the formal boundaries of the broader Anaconda Superfund site had sued Atlantic Richfield directly in Montana State Court, arguing forcefully that the company should be legally required to fund considerably more extensive remediation of their own specific individual properties, including complete arsenic and lead removal, than the comprehensive remediation plan the EPA itself had already formally approved and was actively, continuously overseeing at the time, and the landowners sought a full $60 million in restoration damages specifically to fund that additional remediation work entirely on their own terms. Atlantic Richfield countered forcefully that allowing individual property owners to pursue separate, potentially directly conflicting cleanup standards through ordinary state courts would fundamentally undermine the EPA's own carefully centralized federal authority to manage genuinely complex, multi-decade Superfund remediation projects according to a single, scientifically coordinated master plan, rather than dozens of competing individual demands. The Supreme Court, in a formal decision handed down in April 2020, ultimately ruled that the Montana landowners in question could indeed still pursue their own separate state law claims, but only after first obtaining the EPA's own explicit approval for whatever additional remediation work they specifically hope to independently undertake on their own private properties. A carefully balanced compromise, ruling that preserved individual property owners' underlying legal standing to seek further cleanup relief while still firmly preventing individual private lawsuits from ever overriding the EPA's own centralized technical authority over the broader Superfund site as a whole. The cleanup itself finally reached its formally scheduled completion milestone in 2025, following a comprehensive consent decree finalized between the United States Department of Justice and Atlantic Richfield that permanently locked in the company's remaining final remediation obligations across the entire site. Jesse Laslovich, the sitting United States Attorney for the District of Montana, who personally announced the historic settlement to the assembled press, noted in his own candid public remarks that he had, in fact, been born in Anaconda the very same year the smelter itself first closed back in 1980, and that, while he had personally never once witnessed actual smoke rising from the towering brick stack that still dominates the entire town's skyline to this day, he nonetheless understood exactly what that particular structure had genuinely come to represent for multiple successive generations of both his own family and his neighbors alike, simultaneously a genuine, hard-won source of enduring civic pride in the difficult, dangerous industrial labor that had originally built the entire town from nothing, and an enduring, physically toxic legacy that had ultimately taken considerably longer to properly and fully address than anyone directly involved in the process would ever have honestly wished. Following the consent decree's formal implementation, the EPA indicated publicly that it would continue actively monitoring the site's various completed remediation measures for a minimum of 5 to 10 additional years before any formal consideration could even realistically begin toward eventually removing the Anaconda smelter site from the Superfund program's national priorities list entirely and for good. Anaconda today is a considerably smaller, considerably quieter town than the booming industrial powerhouse Marcus Daly, originally built here back in 1883. Its total population having settled at a comparatively small fraction of its historical mining era peak, its local economy increasingly organized, much like so many other former American company towns scattered across the country, around heritage tourism, outdoor recreation, and a slowly diversifying small business base rather than around the single dominant industrial employer that had once accounted for nearly 4 out of every 5 local jobs available in town. The 585-foot brick smokestack that once carried the smelter's considerable toxic exhaust high up into the Montana sky still stands proudly today, preserved not as an active industrial facility of any kind, but rather as the deliberate centerpiece of Montana's own dedicated Anaconda Smelter Stack State Park, a formally designated historic landmark that both longtime residents and visiting tourists alike can view from a small, well-maintained roadside overlook, though genuine public access to the stack's own immediate base remains permanently restricted, given its ongoing active role at the very center of a still-monitored federal Superfund site. Golfers now play across immaculately manicured fairways built directly atop carefully capped arsenic waste, just a few hundred yards, from where Daly's original smelter workers once labored around the clock. A genuinely improbable, quietly ironic second life for a stretch of ground that spent more than a full century as among the most industrially productive and ultimately among the most seriously contaminated patches of land found anywhere across the entire American West. Marcus Daly pointed at a single grazing cow standing in an empty Montana valley back in 1883 and confidently declared that his brand new town's main street would run directly through that exact spot. 140 years later, that very same valley has now been thoroughly reshaped twice over in succession. First, by one of the richest and most productive copper mining operations the entire world has ever seen, and then, considerably more slowly, and at a total cost ultimately measured in the many hundreds of millions of dollars, by the long, difficult, multi-generational project of carefully cleaning up absolutely everything that same remarkable operation left behind.